Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anisree Suresh, a research associate at the Takshashila Institution and your host for this episode. Today we are joined by Professor Ian Hall from Australia. Professor Ian Hall is a professor of international relations at Griffith University and an academic fellow at the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne. He is the author of many books including Modi and the Reinvention of Indian Foreign Policy, and today we are going to pick his brain to understand the contours of India-Australia relations. Welcome to All Things Policy, Professor.
Hello, it's nice to be with you.
So, getting into the topic of our conversation. So, India-Australia has never been closer, bilaterally and multilaterally. So, looking at this relationship growing and expanding into newer levels and areas, one would definitely wonder, how has India-Australia relationship grown from a cricket, curry and Commonwealth basis to more strategic and comprehensive in nature? So, before we get into the depth of other topics, can you just briefly talk about and set the tone for our conversation?
Yeah, so that's a really good place to start. So if we go back, we don't have to go back very far. We can only if we go back 10 years or even 15 years, what we find is Australia and India kind of vaguely interested in each other, conscious of each other because of the cricket. I think we've probably both forgotten about the Commonwealth and so on. But around that time, there starts to be a kind of recognition, I think, in both capitals that actually we need to not really repair the relationship, but at least take the relationship more seriously and explore what we might be able to do together. And part of that is about China. And part of that is about a recognition that our interests align on China. But also it's about recognizing that, India is growing, that Australia has resources and other things. That also we're starting to see migration into Australia from India. And so there's a whole number of different things that are coming together that persuade both capitals to start talking, really.
Yes. So that's quite interesting. And I think one of my favorite parts about any relationship, any partnership between two countries is the economic angle of it, right? So looking at India has only liberalized its economy in the 1990s, and it continues to have some inhibitions when it comes to free trade agreements and stuff. On the other hand, you have Australian economy, which was dominated by the export of resources and educational services, especially to China, although that has changed a bit in the last few years. So despite of this non-complementarities to some extent, India and Australia signed an early harvest, free trade agreement in April 2023 to open new markets for exporters and service suppliers from both countries. The Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, the ECTA, is considered one of the critical free trade agreements signed between two key markets in the Indo-Pacific region. So how do you look at this, pre-free trade agreement? What are the key learnings for India and Australia? And how does this help their economies and national interest? So on.
Yes, great question. So I think we ought to recognize here that this is a pretty important agreement for both countries. It's important for India because India has been a little bit reticent about free trade agreements, whether those are bilateral or whether they're multilateral. We saw India walk away from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in 2019, for example, and Australia was a bit disappointed about that. So then Australia came back to the table and said, okay, well, if we can't do things multilaterally, let's do things bilaterally. Let's see what we're able to do. But, although, as you rightly say, Australia is a trading nation, it's very committed to open markets and so on, Australia is also pragmatic. And so we wanted to find a place where we could both settle on a deal. There were also some political pressures around that with an election looming in Australia and so on. And so a deal was struck that I think we were both happy and content with, but that neither of us kind of got exactly what we might have wanted. out of it. And all good deals are like that. And it's good that we've left some room for a comprehensive deal to happen down the line, and negotiations are restarting for that next month.
Yeah. So that's like I want to come to that point itself, so there's a lot of progress, there's a lot of conversation happening, how we can shape these negotiations that's starting for a more ambitious comprehensive economic cooperation agreement, so which will probably build upon the ECTA outcomes. So although the ECTA early harvest agreement is bringing the two economies together, there are also certain concerns from both parties, right, including although for an extent these issues were addressed, the regulatory barriers, the missed opportunities, or the law utilization of the free trade agreement as such, especially from India's perspective, and the market access concerns. And again, looking at the economic complementarities between the two economies, and how this has from medium to long term benefits, how this free trade agreement would help. These are all aspects that we've been widely discussing, as well as talking about. So please take us through the challenges and prospects of engaging in a full-fledged free trade agreement between these two economies.
Yes, so that's a very good question. The interesting thing about free trade agreements is that half of their importance lies in the provisions of the free trade agreement. So in the specific sectors of the market that might be opened up, or in the kinds of things that governments might be looking forward to in terms of growing trade in particular areas. But they're also, and Australia's been, recognised this for some time now, they're also signals to manufacturers, to agricultural producers, to others, that governments are committed to a bilateral trade and investment relationship. And so even if there aren't specific provisions in specific market sectors or for specific products that might be beneficial, you're indicating to those sectors that there might be change coming. It might be worth just exploring that country, seeing what can be done even with the current constraints in mind. And I think partly because of the things that were put in place with the ECTA, but also partly because of this broader signaling, we have seen trade, or the volume of trade in goods, at least doubling since the agreement was signed, which is or around 2022, 23, 24, we saw it doubling. So there's been progress already, even just before the agreement, and then after the agreement, we've seen some progress. The big questions, I think, for both sides, there's a number of different things. I think India is always concerned about imbalance of trade, and here this agreement is a bit like the agreements that India has with ASEAN and others, where there's a lot more being imported into India than there is exported out of India, and I think India is going to look to try to rebalance that somehow in some future agreement. And then from the Australian side, there are areas of the Indian economy that Australia would like to have more access to. But we recognize too that those are politically very challenging. So areas like dairy, for example, in agriculture or in wheat, those are areas where, I think we kind of know that India has some red lines for political reasons, for other reasons as well. And so, again, we're not going to get a perfect agreement out of this, but it's going to be a question of which of those various different concerns we can trade off against each other and try to get to something that's a little bit better than what we've already got, or hopefully a lot better than what we've already got.
That's interesting. So just there are also a lot of conversations about the newer revenues of cooperation, right? There's a lot of what India and Australia can do together in terms of critical mineral and blue economy, because these are the areas that Australia has also a lot of expertise to share, and there's a lot of prospects for India's economy as well. So how do you look at these aspects?
Well, those are all really interesting and really promising, and there have been a lot of conversations already about both of those areas. The critical mineral space and some of the emerging technologies and also the areas around batteries, electric vehicles, and so on, that's looking pretty promising. There are still some obstacles there, though. We have big deposits of things like lithium, as well as cobalt and other things. And obviously, we have a very capable mining industry in Australia that has worked in many different areas. The question is, can we get those things out of the ground? Can we refine them? Can we turn them into something that's more useful? And can we do that in Australia, or can we do that with other partners in the region, including India? And then how can we then feed those into new supply chains in terms of battery production, for example, that might take place in India. And I know the Indian government and state governments are really interested in developing. So there's a lot of promise, and there's a lot of government commitment, and there's been a lot of business excitement about these areas. But we're going to have to move quickly and firmly in order to grasp these things. And then on things like blue economy and in sort of maritime space and in some of the green areas as well, again, there's a huge amount of commitment there to try to advance cooperation and to share some of the knowledge that Australia has, and also to try and unlock some of the not just the knowledge, but some of the investment and capital that Australia might be able to bring to the table as well. But that's also an enormously challenging exercise, but again, one that government and business is increasingly committed to.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So, before we look into the China aspect and all those questions, so the negotiations are happening for the comprehensive economic partnership. So, personally to you, where do you think the conversation should focus more on? The negotiation should, primarily prioritize what sectors or what aspects of the free trade agreement?
That's a really, that's a good question. And, it's kind of a technical question, and I'm not an economist, so I'm probably not the best person to look at this. I think there's still areas in agriculture where we could look that, it may be the case that Australia's primary producers might be able to find markets. There's still other areas where I think, India has not got the access that it needs into parts of the Australian economy. So, I think there's, areas like, cars, for example. India is now a very, significant automobile producer and so on. So we're going to have to look very carefully at those sectors. But I think also then at these areas where we're looking to grow a relationship, and we don't want to be putting any barriers in place to try to that would prevent that relationship from developing, particularly in that renewable space, but also in that EV space and all of those things that we are going to need in the green transition. So I think we're going to need to look carefully in those areas as well.
Okay. So coming to the most important question in the Australia relationship, I think not most important, but one of the important factors, the China question. So China's rise and assertive behavior have been a source of concern to both India as well as Australia. So while India's focus is on the border dispute with China and how the PLA's growing presence in the Indian Ocean, Australia is also concerned about growing tensions in the Sino-US relations, and including over Taiwan and China's inroads in the South Pacific and all those factors, right? So at the same time, there's a lot of economic partnership that's been going on between Australia and China as well. So how does this China angle shape the India-Australia relationship?
Yes. So I think, strangely enough, we were actually in some ways in quite a different position 15 years ago when it came to China than we are now. In some odd way, Australia and India have actually converged, at least on the economic side of the relationship. So China-India trade is growing dramatically. It's increased considerably since 2020, for example. And we've seen the similar sorts of things happening also with Australia-China trade. It's kept very strong, and it's been boosted since COVID as well. So we're both now in relationships where we have deep, broad, valuable trading relationships with China, but we also have all of these other disagreements and differences with Beijing. And we also have some issues about how we manage investment in particular. So, and I think here, we started a conversation 10 years ago, and we've ended up in a much closer place in terms of how we need to put in place frameworks to regulate investment, to scrutinize investment, to ensure that the investment that comes in to our countries is not going to be detrimental to our national security, but also our economic security, and in terms of our information technology and all of those sorts of things, critical infrastructure and so on. So we've converged on those things. We do, of course, share those security concerns, and they're not going away because China's behavior has not changed. So China's assertiveness that began in the 2000s, and which has run all the way through the last 20 years or so, those concerns are still there. China's behavior in the South China Sea remains really troubling to Australia. Its behavior when it comes to Taiwan, its behavior towards Japan, it obviously sanctioned us for and put sanctions on various different things that we were trading with China to effectively to punish Australia for calling for a COVID inquiry during the COVID crisis and some other disagreements as well. So that behavior has not really changed. We've tried to moderate and stabilize our relationships. Both India and Australia have tried to do that with China. But a lot of the fundamental problems remain. And it's really up to us, I think, to discuss those things very frankly between Australia and India and to work together to see what we can do, whether it's just to share knowledge or whether it's to collaborate to ensure that all of this disruptiveness does not cause either of us problems, but also doesn't disrupt the region in ways that would be detrimental to everyone.
Indeed. So, just a follow-up question on that. So, like you said, that there's definitely a lot of like economic relationship, partnership with the China, whether we like it or not. Like that's like going strong, and it's gonna like remain that way. So, while at that same time, you also have to manage the strategic aspirations and the strategic autonomy and all those things. So, like, how does India fit in the strategic calculus of Australia in balancing this relationship and maintaining the security and order in the region?
So, India is extremely important to us in multiple different ways. It's important to us because, a strong, robust, autonomous, independent India is a balancing pole, if you like, in the region when it comes to China. And we want the region to be, all of the countries of the region to be as autonomous and independent as possible, and in order for them to make their own choices and not to be coerced or not to be pressured by China into doing things that would not be in their interests or anyone else's interests. So we're really, Australia is just, even if we weren't doing anything together, we would be concerned in ensuring that India is that robust, independent pole in this region. We can work together bilaterally in lots of various different areas. Obviously, for us, diversifying our trade and investment relationships is important from the economic side of things. Obviously, for us too, we have major concerns about the security of the Indian Ocean. We are an Indian Ocean nation. We have large areas that we have to cover, large fishing areas, large areas where we have to do search and rescue. And we also have security concerns about the approaches to the Australian continent. So we need to work together with India in that maritime space. That's very, very important for us. And that just doesn't mean ships and submarines. It also means aircraft. And that's why we work together on maritime patrol and surveillance and those sorts of things as well. So collaborating in those shared spaces is really important. Working together on the economic relationship is important. And then the last part of it as well is that, Australia has changed in one really important India-related way, and that is that we now home to about 1 million people of Indian origin. Some here for a long time. Some came in the end of the 19th century, but most actually came in the last 10 or 15 years. And that has transformed Australia in lots of fantastic ways, bringing all these skillful entrepreneurial people to Australia. And that's been very, very good. But, we now have a shared concern in their welfare and how they prosper and their opportunities and their security and all of those things too. So that's not something that's unimportant in the relationship. It's actually very significant now.
That's quite important, I guess. The diaspora is also one of the crucial aspect that shapes the relationship between the countries, right? Yeah. So, coming to almost towards the end of our podcast, definitely, as we talked, India has a growing role in the Indo-Pacific region, and India and Australia partnership is also quite important to maintain certain kind of order in the region and all those things, and also to maintain and maximize their national interest in the region. So Just like briefly, how this partnership can be shaped to maximize this opportunity. There's definitely a lot of like cooperation, opportunities economically and strategically. There are a lot of like prospects for us to work together in the shared spaces, as you had mentioned. But like, is there any particular like there's a lot thing to do, right? Like, so what's the like right step, especially under the current governments? Like, how we can maximize this relationship.
Yes. So, we've talked about some of those things, and there's still a lot of work to do, both in the economic space and the maritime security space. Those things are really important. We need to work together, I think, to ensure that some of the mechanisms that we're all involved in, like the Quad, work well and flourish. The Quad has had a slightly up and down history, and its reputation in the region, I think, is relatively positive now, but it needs to be stronger because the Quad is very much in our interests. And that means that we need to ensure together that we are delivering some of the things that we are promising through the Quad. And I think, too, we need to explore and be positive about that and be a bit more courageous, perhaps, about that, where we can work together in some of the perhaps the harder edged areas, and that includes areas of security and even in defense as well. So making the Quad work, making that relationship function between the four countries and allowing us to do what we say we're going to do is very important to both of us. So we kind of have this now twin track relationship, one that is minilateral within things like the Quad, and we've got one bilateral relationship, and we need to make both of them work at the same time. So I think those are priorities for us, for Australia as we kind of move forward with India, but we also need to do more, I think, to ensure that some of the problems that we've had in the past don't arise again. Partly because other countries in the region, and one of them is China, will, if they see any kind of differences between countries, the partner countries, they will push them and exploit them and highlight them. And sometimes Australia and India, we have historically, we've been a little bit uncertain about each other's intentions. We've kind of misperceived some of the things that we've done. And we need to work very, very hard to ensure that those things don't arise. And that means building up knowledge, building up connections, building up the relationships that we have. So there's still work to be done there too.
Yeah, I'm actually quite looking forward to how the CECA negotiations are going to shape up too, right? Like, I feel like the economic partnership, if you are able to build a strong foundation on that might be able to like reflect on the other strategic areas as well. So, Professor Ian, it was like a wonderful conversation. I quite enjoyed it. Do you have any last comments for our audience?
Not particularly. Look, I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you today. So thanks so much for inviting me to do this. And it's been fantastic. 10 years ago that we had very few conversations between Australia and India. They were very polite. And we're trying to understand each other. Now the regularity, the frequency of conversation is really warming. It's really a good thing for us both. Yeah. And, so great to have this chat today, and looking forward to more in the future.
Yes. So that's all, like, even for this podcast, it feels like there's quite a lot of topic that we could cover, that we could look into, but it's like, due to time limits and everything, we're like strictly focusing on the few priority areas that we need to highlight today. Anyway, thank you, Professor. It was like quite interesting to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. And all of you, thank you for listening. Let us know about your thoughts on India's growing role in the Indo-Pacific region and in the Australia relation through our social media handles. Until next time, signing off.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.